On the morning of November 12th, 1942, Private Alexei Volkov crouched under a pile of crushed coal slag in the ruins of the Stalingrad tractor factory. His breath froze the moment it escaped his teeth, but he didn't dare move to warm himself. He was watching a burnt-out window frame 340 meters to the northwest. Volkov knew one thing his commanders didn't want to admit. He was being hunted. And the man hunting him wasn't some terrified German conscript. Soviet intelligence called him the Wolf of Silesia, a professional German hunter sent here with a single purpose: to wipe out the Red Army's snipers. In the past 4 days, 12 of the 62nd Army's best snipers had died. They all died the same way: a single bullet through the eye socket, the moment they raised their rifles. Volkov was only 19 years old, with 3 weeks of expedited training. By battlefield logic, he should have been dead yesterday. But Volkov was still alive, not because he was a better shot than the dead men, but because he had realized a brutal truth about his rifle. His weapon, a Mosin-Nagant 91/30 with a PE scope, was a precision monster. It was powerful, reliable, but it had a fatal flaw that was killing Russian soldiers every single day when the sun came up. The problem lay in its perfection. Soviet sniper doctrine required weapons to be clean. Scopes had to be polished. Metal had to be oiled black to prevent rust. Instructors in Moscow would scream if they saw a scratch on a scope mount. A dirty gun is a dead soldier, they said. But in Stalingrad, that doctrine was a death sentence. Volkov's opponent, the German in the building across the way, was a master of light. He wasn't looking for a human shape. He was looking for a reflection, a glint from a lens, or worse, a perfect black metal line amidst the gray rubble. That contrast meant death. Volkov's comrades died because they followed maintenance discipline. They wiped their scopes clean. They kept the blued steel of the scope mount shining under a layer of preservation oil. And when the winter sun hit those perfect metal curves, it created an artificial geometric shape, completely distinct from the chaotic debris around it. The German soldier only had to wait for that perfect stroke to appear in his crosshairs. Volkov had tried following the textbook twice. The first time, a German bullet grazed his fur hat. The second time, it slammed into the shoulder of the spotter lying next to him. The German was too fast. He knew exactly where to look. He was waiting for Volkov to make a third mistake. But this morning, Volkov's rifle didn't look like a military weapon. If a political officer had walked by, he might have shot Volkov on the spot for sabotaging state property. Volkov had spent the entire night in a cellar, using a rough whetstone to scrape off the protective black paint on his scope mount. He had done something insane. He let acid from a dead truck battery drip onto the bare metal, waiting for it to bubble and turn the reddish-brown color of rust. But he didn't stop there. Volkov took a jagged piece of tin from a ration can, beat it until it was deformed, smeared it with mud mixed with axle grease, and crudely welded it over the top of the scope mount. Now, from a distance, his sniper rifle looked like a piece of rusted scrap iron, bent and worthless, discarded in the rubble. It was ugly. It was crude. It violated every rule in the maintenance manual. But Volkov was betting his life on that pile of rusty iron. He slowly inched the rifle through a gap between 2 concrete slabs. The sun began to rise high. The light hit his position directly. According to theory, he was about to die. The sun was blinding. It reflected off the snow, off the shattered concrete, off the thousands of metal shards littering the factory floor. For any other sniper, this lighting condition was a death sentence. It was the devil's mirror, the moment when even a single millimeter of exposed, blued steel would flare up like a signal flare to the enemy. Volkov stopped breathing. He watched through his eyelashes, sweat freezing on his forehead. Across the courtyard, inside the hollowed-out shell of the administrative building, something moved. It wasn't a movement of position, but a movement of focus. The wolf was scanning. Volkov could feel the German's optics passing over him. It was a physical sensation, like a cold hand brushing against his neck. The German sniper was using a Zeiss 4X scope, a piece of optical engineering far superior to Volkov's equipment. That glass could spot a button on a tunic from 600 meters. The wolf's crosshairs swept across the pile of slag where Volkov lay. They lingered. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment where the 12 men before Volkov had died. The German was looking for the geometry of war. The human brain is hardwired to recognize patterns. The perfect circle of a lens, the straight line of a barrel, the smooth curve of a receiver. In the chaos of a bombed-out city, straight lines and perfect circles do not exist naturally. They are the signatures of man. They are the signatures of a target. But the wolf didn't fire. The crosshairs moved on. The German had looked right at Volkov's weapon and seen nothing but garbage. Volkov exhaled, a tiny puff of steam that he immediately dispersed with his hand. The acid-burned mount worked. By destroying the finish of the weapon, by letting it rust and pitting the metal with corrosion, Volkov had broken the geometry of war. The jagged piece of tin he had welded to the top disrupted the perfect circle of the scope tube. To the German, it wasn't a rifle. It was just another twisted piece of rebar sticking out of a destroyed concrete slab. It was the ultimate camouflage. Not blending in with color, but blending in with the texture of destruction. But survival wasn't victory. Volkov was still pinned down. He shifted his eye to the rubber eyepiece of his scope. The image was dark, slightly yellowed by age. He scanned the third floor of the building opposite. The German was good. He was deep inside the room, hidden in the shadows, shooting through a loophole, a small hole knocked through the brick wall so that his muzzle flash would be hidden. Volkov needed him to move. He needed the wolf to make a mistake. Standard Soviet tactics called for a decoy, a helmet on a stick, a mitten raised above the trench. But the wolf was too smart for that. He hadn't fallen for the helmet trick in 3 days. He knew the difference between a puppet and a man. He waited for the breath vapor. He waited for the flinch. Volkov reached into his pocket and pulled out his second modification. It wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror. But not a sniper's mirror. It was a shard of broken glass from a factory window, taped over with soot, leaving only a tiny, jagged corner exposed. He didn't lift it. Instead, he slid it slowly through the slag pile, angling it toward a pile of bricks 5 meters to his left. He wasn't trying to blind the German. He was trying to create a mistake. He adjusted the angle. A tiny, weak glint of light reflected off the shard, hitting the bricks to his left. It looked exactly like a rookie sniper adjusting his scope, accidentally letting the sun catch the lens. It was the kind of mistake a frightened, cold 19-year-old conscript would make. Volkov shifted his finger to the trigger. The trigger pull on the Mosin was heavy, gritty. He had filed it down himself, but it still required a deliberate squeeze. Across the way, the shadows in the third-floor window shifted. The wolf had seen the glint. He was rotating his rifle toward the decoy reflection. He was exposing himself. For a fraction of a second, the German's barrel protruded from the brick loophole. Just the tip of the muzzle brake. It was gray, matte, and perfectly round. Volkov saw it. He didn't look at the German's body. He looked at the flash hider. He estimated the wind. A crosswind blowing from the Volga River, maybe 3 meters per second. He aimed 2 centimeters to the right of the loophole. His own scope mount, that ugly, rusty, deformed piece of metal, held the optics steady. It didn't gleam. It didn't shine. It sat there like a piece of trash, hiding the instrument of death beneath it. Volkov began to squeeze. The Mosin-Nagant kicked hard against Volkov's shoulder. The sound was deafening, a sharp, cracking thunderclap that echoed off the concrete skeletons of the factory, rolling down the empty corridors like a physical wave. In the exact same microsecond, a second crack split the air. Volkov didn't blink. He kept his eye pressed to the scope, riding the recoil. Through the yellowed glass, he saw the result. 5 meters to his left, the pile of bricks where he had placed the mirror shard exploded. Dust and pulverized red clay puffed into the air. The wolf had taken the bait. He had fired a perfect, center-mass shot at the glint of light, exactly where he thought a careless Russian sniper was hiding. But Volkov's bullet had flown true. Across the courtyard, inside the dark square of the third-floor loophole, there was no red puff of brick dust. There was something else. A pink mist. A spray of biological matter that caught the sunlight for a brief, horrifying second before disappearing back into the shadows. The German's rifle barrel jerked violently upwards, then slid back out of sight. Silence rushed back into the vacuum left by the gunshots. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Volkov lay perfectly still. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his hands were steady. He didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. In the sniper war, celebration was just another noise that got you killed. He watched the window. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Nothing moved. No fresh barrel appeared. No spotter cried out. The Wolf of Silesia was gone. Volkov slowly pulled the bolt back. The empty brass casing spun out into the snow, steaming in the cold air. He caught it with his gloved hand before it could clatter against the rocks. Sound discipline, always. He looked down at his rifle. The abomination. The rust was stark against the white snow. The jagged tin shield over the scope looked ridiculous, like something a child would build out of scraps. But that ugliness had just saved his life. The German had scanned right past him. The Wolf's eyes, trained to find the perfect blue-black symmetry of a weapon, had simply slid over the rough, corroded texture of Volkov's gun. The Wolf had died because he was looking for a soldier, and Volkov had disguised himself as debris. But Volkov knew the rules of Stalingrad. You fire once, you move, or you die. The German mortar teams would be dialing in his coordinates right now. The echo of his shot gave them a general direction. The Wolf might be dead, but the pack was still hunting. He began the crawl. It was a slow, agonizing reverse slither. He didn't lift his head. He didn't lift his butt. He dragged himself backward through the sharp slag, letting the jagged rocks tear at his padded trousers. He kept the rusted rifle cradled in his arms like a newborn baby. 10 minutes later, he slipped into the safety of a collapsed sewer pipe that served as a transit tunnel for the Soviet defenders. The air inside smelled of unwashed bodies, cordite, and boiled cabbage. It was the smell of home. He made his way back to the command dugout in the basement of the ruined department store. It was warm here. A kerosene lamp sputtered on a crate. "Volkov!" The voice was sharp, commanding. It was Lieutenant Zaitsev, no relation to the famous Vasily, just a sour-faced logistics officer from Moscow. He was sitting behind a makeshift desk, reviewing ammunition logs. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Volkov. And then, they landed on the rifle. Volkov froze. He had forgotten to cover it. The rusted, acid-burned, tin-welded mess was exposed in the yellow lamplight. Zaitsev stood up, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the political banner on the wall. He walked around the desk, pointing a shaking finger at the weapon. "What?" Zaitsev hissed, his voice trembling with genuine outrage. "Have you done to your weapon, Private?" This was the moment Volkov had feared more than the German sniper. In the Red Army, sabotage of equipment was a crime punishable by a penal battalion or execution. Destroying the finish of a precision instrument? Ruining the state's property with acid and rust? That was sabotage. "I asked you a question, Volkov." Zaitsev grabbed the barrel of the rifle, looking at the corrosion with disgust. "Look at this. It's ruined. You've let it rot. This is a disgrace to the Red Army. This is a court-martial offense." Volkov stood at attention, tired, cold, the adrenaline fading into a dull ache in his bones. He looked at the officer, a man who had never spent a minute above ground scanning a kill zone. "It's not rot, Comrade Lieutenant," Volkov said, his voice raspy from dehydration. "It's camouflage." "Camouflage?" Zaitsev scoffed, scraping a flake of rust off the receiver with his fingernail. "It's laziness. It's neglect. You think you can treat a precision instrument like a shovel? I'm putting you on report. You'll be lucky if you're only digging latrines for the next month. Give me that weapon." He reached to confiscate the rifle. "Comrade Lieutenant," a new voice spoke from the shadows of the tunnel entrance. It was deep, calm, and carried a weight that made Zaitsev freeze. Major Konovalov stepped into the light, the battalion commander. He looked at Volkov, then at the ruined rifle, and finally at the logistics officer. "Did you get him, Volkov?" the major asked. Volkov nodded once. "The German in the admin building. The one with the Zeiss scope. He's down." The major looked at Zaitsev. "That German has killed 12 of my men in 4 days. 12 men with perfectly clean, perfectly oiled, perfectly shiny rifles." He walked over to Volkov, took the rusted rifle from Zaitsev's hand, and held it up to the light. He inspected the crude tin shield, the brown acid burns, the utter lack of straight lines. He didn't look disgusted. He looked intrigued. "He didn't see you, did he?" the major asked softly. "No, Comrade Major." He looked right at me. He thought I was garbage. The major handed the rifle back to Volkov. He turned to Zaitsev. "Lieutenant, tear up that report." "But, Comrade Major," Zaitsev sputtered, "the regulations, the maintenance manual clearly states." "The manual," Konovalov interrupted, his voice like grinding stones, "was written in Moscow. We are in Stalingrad. In Moscow, a clean gun gets you a medal. In Stalingrad, a clean gun gets you a funeral." He turned back to Volkov. "Get some sleep, Private. Tomorrow, you're going to teach the others how to ruin their rifles." The basement of the Red October steelworks became a sanctuary of destruction. But they weren't destroying the enemy. They were destroying their own gear. Volkov stood at the head of a long, makeshift workbench made of ammunition crates. In front of him sat 20 men. Some were fresh conscripts, their faces pale and clean. Others were hardened veterans, men with 1,000-yard stares and bandages wrapped around their hands. They all looked at Volkov with a mixture of curiosity and horror. In Volkov's hand was a jar of industrial acid, scavenged from the etching department of the steelworks. "The first rule," Volkov said, his voice quiet but echoing off the damp concrete walls, "is that you must stop loving your rifle. If you love it, you will polish it. If you polish it, you will die." He picked up a brand new Mosin-Nagant sniper rifle, just issued from the supply train across the Volga. The wood was varnished a deep, rich amber. The metal was blued to a perfect, deep black satin finish. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. Volkov took a handful of coarse sand and rubbed it violently against the wooden stock. The veterans winced. It was like watching someone key a luxury car. He scuffed the varnish until the wood looked raw, old, and splintered. Then, he took a rag soaked in the acid and wiped it across the barrel and the scope mount. The chemical hissed. The beautiful blue finish dissolved, leaving behind dull, gray, vulnerable metal. "It feels like a sin," a sergeant in the front row muttered. He was an old hunter from Siberia, a man who had treated his hunting rifles like religious icons his whole life. "Dying is the only sin here, Sergeant," Volkov replied. "The Germans are looking for soldiers. We are going to become trash." Over the next week, the transformation of the 62nd Army Sniper Corps began. It was an unauthorized, underground movement. There were no official orders from Moscow. No manuals were rewritten. But in the trenches of Stalingrad, word spread like a virus. "The kid who killed the wolf says rust makes you invisible." They raided the factory floor for scraps. They found strips of burlap sacking, rusted wire, torn sheet metal, and old rags soaked in motor oil. They wrapped their barrels in dirty bandages. They welded jagged metal fins to their scope rings to break up the round silhouette. They deliberately let frost accumulate on the bolts. By late November, Volkov's unit didn't look like a military formation. They looked like scavengers. Their weapons looked like they had been dug up from a grave. And the results were immediate. The German snipers, the elite Jaegers who had dominated the ruins for months, suddenly found themselves shooting at ghosts. They would scan a pile of rubble, seeing nothing but twisted metal and broken bricks. They would see no straight lines, no black metal, no glint of glass. They would relax, thinking the sector was clear. And then the pile of rubble would flash. The kill ratios began to shift terrifyingly fast. In October, for every German sniper killed, the Russians lost 2. By the first week of December, the ratio had flipped. The Rus snipers were taking 3 Germans for every loss. German intelligence reports from the sector began to sound frantic. They reported that the Russians had developed a new type of smokeless, flashless weaponry. They reported that the Russians were firing from fortified bunkers that didn't exist. They couldn't understand how a shooter could be lying in an open pile of slag, completely exposed, and yet remain invisible to a trained observer looking right at him. But invisibility had a price. The harsh Stalingrad winter was setting in. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. The rust that saved their lives was also killing their guns. Corrosion is a cancer. Volkov had to teach his men a delicate, dangerous balance. They had to let the exterior of the rifle rot, but the internal mechanism, the bolt, the firing pin, the bore, had to be surgical. Every night, while the wind howled outside, the Rust brothers performed a strange ritual. They would strip their rifles in the dark. They would meticulously clean the internals, oiling the bolt rails with a mixture of gasoline and oil to prevent freezing. but they would not touch the outside. They treated the rust on the scope mount like a precious coating of gold. Volkov sat in his corner of the dugout, cleaning his bolt. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold and the chemicals. He looked at his rifle. It was uglier than ever. The tin shield over the scope was bent from where he had banged it against a door frame. The barrel was a streak of orange corrosion. It was the ugliest thing he had ever owned, and he loved it. But the Germans were not stupid. They were the masters of war, and they adapted. If their snipers couldn't find the Russians, they would stop using snipers. On December 5th, the tactic changed. Volkov was positioned on the 4th floor of a bombed-out flour mill, overlooking a critical intersection. He was waiting for a German messenger runner. He had been lying there for 6 hours, a pile of old rags and rusted iron in a corner full of debris. He didn't see a soldier. He heard a mechanical grind, a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards. Around the corner of the street, a beast appeared. A Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun. Low profile, heavy armor, mounting a 75mm cannon. It wasn't looking for targets. It was looking for places. The German commander popped the hatch, scanned the building line with binoculars. He didn't see Volkov. He didn't see any snipers. He saw only ruins. Feuer auf Verdacht. The commander ordered into his headset, fire on suspicion. The tank wasn't aiming at a person. It was aiming at the building itself. The Germans had decided that if they couldn't find the needle in the haystack, they would simply burn the haystack down. The turret traversed. The black eye of the 75mm cannon stared straight at the flour mill. Volkov realized with a jolt of cold terror that his invisibility didn't matter anymore. You can't hide from high explosives. The world turned white. Then it turned red. The 75mm high explosive shell from the Sturmgeschütz slammed into the 3rd floor support pillar of the flour mill. It didn't just break the wall, it vaporized it. A shockwave moving at supersonic speed tore through the room, lifting Volkov off the floor and throwing him against the back wall like a rag doll. The air was instantly replaced by a choking cloud of pulverized brick dust and cordite. Volkov couldn't hear anything. His eardrums had shut down to protect his brain. He couldn't breathe. He lay in a pile of debris, half buried under a collapsed wooden beam, tasting copper and blood in his mouth. But he was alive. The German tank commander had aimed for the center of the room. Volkov had been in the corner, protected by the structural reinforcement. If he had been a clean sniper, sitting in a standard firing position near the window, he would be a pink mist right now. But because he fought like a scavenger, hiding deep in the trash, the blast had only concussed him. Through the ringing in his ears, he felt a vibration in the floor. Clank, clank, clank. The tank was moving forward. It was grinding over the rubble, crushing the masonry under its steel treads. The Germans were confident. They believed nothing could survive a direct hit from a 75mm cannon. Volkov dragged himself free from the timber. He grabbed his rifle. The scope was covered in gray dust, but the crude tin shield was still attached. The bolt was jammed with grit. He racked it violently, forcing the action open, ejecting a bent cartridge, and chambering a fresh one. He wasn't running. He was repositioning. He crawled through a hole in the floorboards, dropping down to the 2nd level. He limped to a jagged crack in the outer wall. Below him, the metal beast was passing just 20 meters away. It was invincible to his rifle. His 7.62mm armor-piercing bullet would bounce off that sloped steel hull like a pebble thrown at a mountain. But every beast has eyes, and eyes are soft. Major Konovalov had briefed them on this the night before. A tank is terrifying, he had said, but only if it can see you. If you take away its eyes, it becomes a 20-ton coffin. The German commander had buttoned up. The hatch was closed. He was now driving using the periscopes and vision slits, blocks of thick, laminated glass protected by steel shutters. Volkov rested his rifle on a piece of broken plumbing pipe. The rust on his barrel blended perfectly with the corroded iron. The German infantry walking behind the tank, the support troops meant to protect it, scanned the windows. They saw nothing but ruin. Volkov focused his scope. The distance was point blank for a sniper. 50 meters. He didn't aim for the hull. He didn't aim for the tracks. He aimed for a small, rectangular block of glass on the driver's side vision port. It was no bigger than a pack of cigarettes. He exhaled. The pain in his ribs was agonizing, but his hands were steady. He squeezed the trigger. Crack. The shot was lost in the noise of the tank's engine, but the impact was undeniable. The bullet struck the center of the vision block. It didn't penetrate the cabin, but it shattered the laminated glass instantly, turning it into a spiderweb of opaque white cracks. Inside the tank, the driver suddenly went blind. He panicked. He slammed on the left brake, trying to pivot. The tank jerked violently to the left, crashing into a pile of structural debris. The track spun helplessly, stripping the gears. The beast was stuck. Volkov worked the bolt. Click-clack. He shifted his aim to the commander's cupola periscope, the glass eye rotating on top of the turret. Crack. Another hit. The glass shattered. Now the commander was blind too. The tank stopped firing. The turret stopped traversing. It was just a paralyzed lump of steel sitting in the middle of the kill zone. Panic spreads faster than fire. The German infantry behind the tank didn't know what was happening. They only saw their heavy support stop moving. They saw the turret freeze. They thought the tank had been hit by an anti-tank gun. They broke formation, diving for cover, leaving the tank exposed. Volkov had effectively killed the tank without penetrating its armor. He had stripped it of its sensory input, but as he watched the crew hatch crack open the Germans, trying to bail out of their blinded vehicle, he realized something. The rust tactic had evolved. It wasn't just about hiding anymore. It was about psychological warfare. He had just proven that a single man with a rusted rifle could stop an armored assault. But the war in Stalingrad wasn't just about tanks and snipers. It was about to go underground. That night, back in the sewers, Volkov received a new order. The Germans were adapting again. They were bringing in dogs, Alsatians, trained to smell the oil on a rifle, the sweat of a man, and the residue of gunpowder. Camouflage works against eyes. It doesn't work against a nose that can smell fear. Volkov, the major said, handing him a jar of something that smelled vile. If we want to survive the dogs, we have to smell like the dead. The jar Major Konovalov placed on the table didn't look dangerous. It was an old glass container that once held pickled cucumbers. But when Volkov unscrewed the rusted lid, the smell that filled the dugout was physical. It was a thick, oily stench that made the eyes water and the stomach churn. It was the smell of the battlefield condensed into a paste. Rendered fat from the field kitchen, mixed with sulfur, rotting vegetation, and earth taken from the perimeter of the mass graves near the Volga. It was the scent of decay. The Germans are using Alsatians, Konovalov said, his face impassive. They are sweeping the factory district sector by sector. If you smell like a soldier like gun oil, tobacco, and sweat, you are dead. To survive, you must smell like the ruins. Volkov didn't hesitate. He dipped his gloved fingers into the dark, greasy paste. He smeared it over his heavy felt boots. He rubbed it into the wool of his coat. He even dabbed a streak of it on his cheek. The other men in the unit watched, then followed suit. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were becoming part of the necrosis of the city. An hour later, Volkov was lying in a bomb crater near the Red October warehouse. It was night, but the sky was illuminated by the constant flicker of flares. The ground was frozen hard. He heard them before he saw them. The panting, the clicking of claws on ice. A German patrol was moving through the wreckage. 6 infantrymen with MP-40 submachine guns, led by a handler holding a leash. At the end of the leash was a massive gray Alsatian. The dog was a biological radar. It moved with its nose to the ground, weaving through the debris. It wasn't looking, it was inhaling the world. Volkov lay perfectly still, his rifle buried under a layer of dirty snow. He slowed his heart rate, a technique he had learned to stop his body from generating heat waves. The dog stopped. It raised its head. Its ears pricked up. It had caught a scent. Volkov stopped breathing. The dog turned. It began to pull the handler toward the crater. The German soldiers raised their weapons, sensing the animal's alert. They spread out, fingers on triggers. The dog reached the edge of the crater. It was less than 3 meters from Volkov's face. He could see the steam rising from its muzzle. He could see the intelligent, amber eyes scanning the darkness. If the dog barked, Volkov would be riddled with bullets in seconds. The animal lowered its nose. It sniffed the air deeply, taking in the molecules drifting from Volkov's position. It smelled the sulfur. It smelled the rotting vegetation. It smelled the death. To a dog, a living human smells like salt and heat. A dead thing smells like this paste. The dog sneezed. It shook its head, losing interest. It didn't smell prey. It smelled carrion. It smelled something that had been dead for weeks. There was no sport in a corpse. The handler tugged the leash. Was this los, boy? Nichts? What is it, boy? Nothing? The dog turned away from the crater and pulled toward the west, catching the scent of a rat or a stray cat. The patrol moved on. Their heavy boots crunched past Volkov's head, so close that he could have reached out and untied their laces. They walked right past a living, breathing enemy, because their primary sensor, the dog, had told them it was just a pile of rotting garbage. Volkov waited until the sound of their footsteps faded into the wind. He exhaled, the foul taste of the paste filling his mouth. He felt a strange sensation. It wasn't relief. It was a cold, hollow realization. He had stripped away his weapon's beauty. He had stripped away his human silhouette. Now he had stripped away his own scent. He was systematically erasing his humanity to become a perfect killing machine. But the Germans were running out of tricks. They had tried counter-snipers. Failed. They had tried tanks. Failed. They had tried dogs. Failed. Desperation makes an army dangerous, but it also makes them careless. As December dragged on, the German 6th Army began to starve. The encirclement Operation Uranus had closed the ring. The hunter was now the trapped animal, and Volkov noticed a change in his targets. They weren't moving with the sharp, predatory discipline of November. They were moving sluggishly. They were wrapped in stolen blankets, women's shawls, and rags. They were freezing, and when men freeze, they make mistakes. They light fires. On Christmas Eve, 1942, Volkov spotted something that would change the psychological war forever. He was watching a German trench line. He saw a faint wisp of smoke rising from a dugout. A careless mistake? No, it was too deliberate. He adjusted his scope. Through the rusted, tin-shielded lens, he saw a German officer. He wasn't hiding. He was standing on the parapet, holding something up. A white flag? No. He was holding a bottle of schnapps and a piece of bread. He was shouting something across the no-man's land. Russian. Ivan, come eat. Tonight. No shooting. It was a truce offer. A moment of humanity in hell. Volkov looked at the man. He looked at the bread, his stomach cramped with hunger. But then he remembered the Wolf of Silesia. He remembered the 12 men who had died because of a glint of light. He remembered the tank blowing up the flour mill. He lowered his eye to the scope. In Stalingrad, mercy was just another trap. The bottle of schnapps shattered before the German officer's body even hit the frozen mud. The bullet had passed through the glass, through the man's chest, and buried itself in the trench wall behind him. The piece of bread he was offering fell into the snow, instantly stained red. There was no Christmas truce in Stalingrad. Volkov cycled the bolt. Click-clack. He didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel triumph. He felt only the recoil. In his mind, the officer wasn't a man offering peace. He was a target, offering a silhouette. If Volkov had hesitated, if he had accepted the bread, he would have softened, and soft things die in the winter. The reaction from the German lines was instant and apocalyptic. They didn't fire back with rifles. They didn't send snipers. They sent the Nebelwerfer, the screaming mimes. 6-barreled rocket launchers shrieked from the German rear. The air filled with a sound like tearing canvas, followed by a series of explosions that turned the factory courtyard into a churning sea of fire and shrapnel. Volkov and his unit didn't run. They melted. They slipped into the storm drains, descending deeper into the bowels of the city. The surface was no longer habitable. The war had moved vertically, but the Germans were done playing hide and seek. If they couldn't see the rust ghosts, they would burn them out. 2 days later, Volkov heard a new sound echoing through the sewer pipes. It wasn't the sharp crack of a rifle or the boom of artillery. It was a hiss, a deep, pressurized hiss, followed by a roar that sounded like a jet engine. The air in the tunnel suddenly grew hot. The smell of rot and excrement was replaced by the chemical sting of unrefined gasoline. "Sturmpionier," Major Konovalov whispered, gripping his PP-6 submachine gun. "Combat engineers. They have brought the flamethrowers." The Germans were systematically clearing the tunnels. They weren't checking corners. They were simply sticking the nozzle of a Flammenwerfer 41 into a tunnel entrance and pulling the trigger. A jet of liquid fire, burning at 1,000 degrees Celsius, would rush down the pipe, consuming all oxygen, boiling the water, and incinerating anything living. Volkov was trapped in a junction chamber with 3 other snipers. The tunnel ahead glowed orange. The heat was intensifying. He could hear the heavy boots of the German operator clanking on the metal rungs of the maintenance ladder 50 meters away. He couldn't shoot. The tunnel was filled with thick, black, oily smoke. His scope, even his rusted, trusted scope, was useless. He was blind. "We have to fall back," one of the younger snipers hissed, panic widening his eyes. "No," Volkov said, his voice dry. "If we run, they chase. If they chase, they burn us from behind. We have to kill the dragon." He looked at his rifle. The acid-etched metal was warm to the touch. The rust looked like dried blood. He realized that camouflage wasn't just about sight. It was about behavior. The flamethrower operator was confident. He believed he was the apex predator. He believed that fire cleansed everything. He wasn't looking for a target. He was looking for movement. Volkov did the opposite of what a human being wants to do when faced with fire. He moved toward the heat. He crawled forward into the smoke, low against the sewage water. He pressed himself into a small drainage alcove, a crack in the wall barely big enough for a dog. He pulled a piece of charred wood over his head. He became part of the burnt wall. The German operator stepped into the junction. He was a giant in a heavy asbestos suit, wearing a mask that made him look like an insect. On his back was the twin-tank reservoir of death. He raised the nozzle, preparing to flood the next section of the tunnel with flame. The pilot light at the tip of the weapon flickered blue. Volkov was 3 meters away. He was so close he could hear the gas regulator hissing. He didn't aim for the man's head. The mask was thick, the glass reinforced. He didn't aim for the chest. The asbestos suit was heavy. He waited until the operator turned slightly to check his pressure gauge. The tanks on his back were exposed. 2 cylinders of compressed nitrogen and fuel, thin steel, highly pressurized. Volkov didn't use his scope. At this range, he didn't need it. He pointed the rusted barrel of the Mosin-Nagant like a finger. He squeezed. The bullet sparked off the steel tank. It didn't explode like in the movies. Reality is crueler. The bullet punctured the fuel reservoir. A high-pressure stream of gasoline sprayed out, drenching the operator's back. The German shouted, turning around, trying to see what had hit him. As he turned, the spray of fuel hit the pilot light at the tip of his own weapon. Physics took over. The flame didn't shoot forward. It traveled backward, riding the stream of fuel instantly to the source. The operator became a torch. He screamed a sound that was cut short as the heat sucked the air out of his lungs. The tanks on his back ruptured from the pressure change. Volkov buried his face in the muck as the shockwave rolled over him. The tunnel lit up brighter than the sun. The dragon had consumed itself. When the fire died down, there was only a charred husk and the smell of cooked meat. Volkov stood up, dripping with sewage. His rifle was black with soot, the rust now baked into the metal. He looked at the body. He felt nothing. The fire had burned away the last remnants of Alexei Volkov the boy. Only the rust remained. But the explosion had done something else. It had collapsed the ceiling of the junction. Light, real, natural sunlight was streaming down from a hole above. And through that hole, Volkov heard something impossible. He heard music. The hole in the ceiling was a jagged mouth of concrete, framing a square of pale, winter sky. The music drifted down like snow. It was a piano. A complex, haunting melody of Bach, played with a frantic, desperate precision that had no place in a slaughterhouse. Volkov clawed his way up the pile of rubble that had formed under the collapse. His hands were burned, his uniform was stiff with frozen sewage, and his rifle was a blackened, warped stick of iron. He looked like a creature born of the earth's anger. He emerged into the atrium of what used to be the Univermag department store. The once grand shopping center was now a cavern of shadows and ice, and there, in the center of the hall, sat a grand piano. It had been dragged out of a showroom, miraculously intact. Seated at the keys was a German officer. He wore a greatcoat that was 3 sizes too big, and his hands were wrapped in fingerless wool gloves. Around him, hundreds of German soldiers lay on the floor. Some were wounded, swathed in bloody bandages that had turned gray. Others were simply freezing, huddled together like sheep in a storm. They didn't look up as Volkov emerged from the ground. They were lost in the music. It was their last tether to civilization. Volkov raised his rifle. The movement was instinctive. He sought a target. He swept the room, but there were too many targets, and yet there were none. These weren't the wolves he had fought in November. These weren't the arrogant panzer crews of December. These were ghosts. Their eyes were hollow, sunken into skulls that looked like parchment stretched over bone. The arrogance of the master race had been eaten away by lice, typhus, and starvation. The officer at the piano played a final, discordant chord. He stopped. His hands fell to his lap. Slowly, he turned his head. He looked straight at the pile of rubble where Volkov was crouching. The Germans saw him. He saw the blackened face, the burnt eyebrows, the rifle that looked like a piece of rusted pipe. The officer didn't reach for his Luger. He didn't shout an alarm. He simply looked at Volkov with a terrible, empty exhaustion. Then he nodded. A small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "You are here. The end is here." Volkov lowered his eye to the scope. The crosshairs settled on the officer's chest. The shot was easy. Stationary target. 100 meters. No wind. But Volkov didn't pull the trigger. For the first time in 2 months, the logic of the rust failed him. You camouflage yourself to hide from a hunter. You destroy your silhouette to deceive a killer. But you cannot hide from a man who was already looking at his own grave. Volkov realized that shooting this man wouldn't be an act of war. It would be an act of mercy. And he had no mercy left to give. He lowered the rifle. He didn't shoot. Instead, he did something far more cruel. He let them live. He let them sit there in the freezing cold, with their memories of music and their rotting limbs, knowing that the trash they had despised was now standing over them, watching them die. He turned and slipped back into the shadows of the stairwell. He had a different mission now. The German army wasn't an enemy anymore. It was a corpse. The real battle was about to begin, the battle to bury it. January 1943 brought the end. The Soviet High Command launched Operation Ring, the final strangulation of the Stalingrad pocket. Volkov's unit, the Rust brothers, were pulled out of the sewers and placed at the tip of the spear. They weren't fighting as snipers anymore. They were infiltration shock troops. Their rusted weapons, once a mark of shame, had become a badge of honor. The tactic had spread. Entire battalions were now camouflaging their gear with mud, wire, and scrap metal. The Volkov style had become the unofficial doctrine of urban warfare. On January 26th, Volkov stood on the heights of Mamayev Kurgan, the ancient burial mound that overlooked the city. From here, he could see the entire battlefield. The German pocket had been sliced in two. The airfield at Potomnik had fallen. The airlift was gone. The Luftwaffe had promised to supply the army from the air, but they were dropping less than 10% of what was needed. Volkov watched through his scope as a German transport plane, a Junkers Ju-52, tried to land on a makeshift runway carved out of the ice. It was coming in low, desperate. "Distance?" Major Konovalov asked, standing beside him with binoculars. 800 meters, Volkov replied. "Moving target." "Can you hit the pilot?" Volkov looked at his rifle. The barrel was pitted. The rifling was worn. The scope mount was held together by a weld that looked like a tumor. "No," Volkov said, "but I can hit the engine." He led the target. The big, slow transport plane was lumbering through the air like a dying whale. Volkov fired. The bullet didn't hit the engine. It hit the fuel line in the wing root. The plane didn't explode. It just gave up. The engine sputtered and died. The aircraft dipped a wing, caught the edge of a ruined building, and cartwheeled into the snow. A cheer went up from the Soviet lines. But Volkov didn't cheer. He was looking at the wreckage. The cargo bay had split open. It wasn't carrying ammunition. It wasn't carrying food. It was carrying Iron Cross medals. Boxes and boxes of medals, sent by Hitler to reward the dying men for their loyalty. Volkov stared at the shiny silver medals, spilling out into the dirty snow. "Look at that," he whispered. "They sent them shiny metal." He patted the rusted receiver of his Mosin-Nagant. They should have sent them rust. On February 2nd, 1943, at 16 hours, a sound terrified Alexei Volkov more than any artillery barrage he had endured in 5 months. It was the sound of nothing. The guns stopped. The screaming rockets stopped. The grinding of tank tracks stopped. The silence that fell over Stalingrad was heavy, physical, and suffocating. It rang in the ears like a high-pitched scream. Volkov was sitting on a pile of concrete slabs near the barricadey gun factory. He was scraping a tin of frozen beef with his bayonet. He stopped eating. He looked up at the sky. For the first time in 200 days, the smoke was clearing. The air was still gray, but it wasn't burning. "It's over," Major Konovalov said, lighting a cigarette with a hand that shook uncontrollably. "They have surrendered." Volkov didn't cheer. The men around him, the Rus brothers, didn't celebrate. They just sat there, looking like statues carved from mud and ice. They had spent so long becoming part of the debris that they didn't know how to be human anymore. An hour later, the procession began. Out of the basements, out of the sewers, out of the bunkers, the 6th Army marched into captivity. 91,000 men. They were the remnants of the most powerful military force on Earth. But they didn't look like conquerors. They looked like ghosts wrapped in rags. Volkov watched them pass. He saw their eyes. They were wide, staring at nothing, the 1,000-year stare. He saw a German soldier stumble and fall. The man didn't try to get up. He just lay there in the snow, curling into a fetal position, waiting to die. A Russian guard nudged him, then walked away. There was no point in brutality anymore. The winter had already beaten them. And then Volkov saw the weapons. The Germans were ordered to pile their rifles in a designated area. A pyramid of steel began to grow in the center of the square. Thousands of Mauser K98S, MP40 submachine guns, Luger pistols. Volkov walked over to the pile. He picked up a Mauser sniper rifle. It was the weapon of the Wolf of Silesia, the weapon of the masters. He inspected it. Even after months of fighting, the craftsmanship was undeniable. The bolt action was smooth as glass. The walnut stock was perfectly shaped. The markings were precise. It was a beautiful machine, but it was jammed with ice. The tight tolerances, the perfect engineering that made it so accurate on a shooting range, had made it fragile in the apocalypse. It couldn't handle the grit. It couldn't handle the neglect. It demanded perfection in an imperfect world. Volkov looked down at his own Mosin-Nagant. It was hideous. The stock was scarred and wrapped in dirty bandages. The scope mount was a rusted, welded lump of iron. The tin shield he had hammered out of a food can was still there, bent and jagged. The bolt rattled when he shook it. It was loose. It was sloppy. But when he pulled that bolt back, it moved. It stripped a round from the magazine and chambered it with a satisfying, ugly clunk. It worked. It worked because it was loose. It worked because it was simple. It worked because it had allowed itself to become ugly. "You see that?" Konovalov asked, standing beside him, looking at the mountain of German guns. "That is the grave of perfection." Volkov threw the German rifle onto the pile. It clattered against the others, a sound of defeat. "They tried to impose order on chaos," Volkov said quietly. "We just became the chaos." He walked away from the pile. He found a bucket of water near a field kitchen. He took off his gloves. He dipped his hands into the freezing water and began to scrub his face. He scrubbed hard. He wanted to wash off the perfume of the dead. He wanted to wash off the soot, the grease, the rust. He wanted to see Alexei Volkov again. The water turned black. Then it turned red as he scrubbed the skin raw. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, the stain didn't come off. The dirt had gone too deep. It was under his fingernails. It was in his pores. It was in his eyes. He looked at his reflection in the dark water. The face staring back at him was not 19 years old. It was ancient. It was a face made of stone and iron. The eyes were cold, flat, and devoid of light. He realized then that the war hadn't just changed his rifle. It had changed him. He had rusted. He had corroded his own soul to survive. He had stripped away his empathy, his fear, his hope, just like he had stripped the varnish off his gun stock. And just like the rifle, he could never be polished back to what he was before. Volkov, a political officer, was waving at him from a truck. A camera crew was setting up. They wanted to film the heroes of Stalingrad. They wanted the clean snipers. "Get over here. We need a picture for Pravda. Clean yourself up. Wipe that mud off your rifle." Volkov looked at the officer. He looked at his rusted gun. He didn't move. He didn't wipe the gun. He slung the ugly, corroded weapon over his shoulder and walked toward the camera. "No," Volkov said to himself. "Take the picture as it is. Let them see the rust." The camera shutter clicked. A single frame of history was captured on silver nitrate film. The photograph that appeared in Pravda the next week showed a young hero of the Soviet Union standing tall among the ruins. But the editors in Moscow had done their work. They had airbrushed the image. In the newspaper, Volkov's face looked clean. His uniform looked crisp. And the rifle, the rusted, acid-scarred abomination that had saved his life, had been retouched to look like a standard, black-blued military-issue weapon. The state didn't want the truth. They didn't want the world to know that their victory was built on scrap metal and disobedience. They wanted the myth of perfection. But Volkov didn't care about the myth. He cared about survival. He didn't hand the rifle over to the museum in Stalingrad. He kept it. He carried that piece of rusted iron through the mud of Kursk, through the forests of Belarus, and finally into the burning streets of Berlin in 1945. By the end of the war, the rifle was unrecognizable. The wooden stock was held together by copper wire. The bolt was so loose it rattled like a baby's toy. The tin shield over the scope had been replaced 3 times. But it never jammed. It never failed. And most importantly, it never shined. Alexei Volkov survived the war. He returned to Stalingrad in 1946, not as a soldier, but as a construction worker. He spent the next 40 years rebuilding the very city he had helped destroy. He married, had 2 daughters, and lived a quiet life in a concrete apartment block built over the ruins of the tractor factory. He never talked about the Rust brothers. He never mentioned the Wolf of Silesia. When asked about the war, he would simply show his hands scarred and calloused from years of masonry work and say, "We did what was necessary." Volkov died in 1988, just a few years before the country he fought for ceased to exist. His rifle was found in a closet, wrapped in an oil-soaked blanket. It was donated to the Volgograd State Panorama Museum. For years, curators didn't know what to do with it. It was too ugly to display. It looked like junk. They kept it in the storage room, labeled simply, "Sniper Rifle, Modified, 7.62 millimeters." It wasn't until modern military historians began analyzing the kill statistics of the 62nd Army that they realized the truth. They compared the survival rates of snipers who maintained regulation weapons versus those who adopted field modifications. The data was undeniable. The clean snipers had a life expectancy of 2 weeks. The rusted snipers survived for years. Volkov's stupid trick, the acid, the mud, the tin shield, wasn't just an act of desperation. It was a leap in military evolution. He had intuitively understood a concept that modern special forces now call signature reduction. Today, every modern sniper rifle is designed with matte finishes, honeycomb kill flashes on the scopes, and irregular camouflage patterns. They are designed to look like nothing. They are designed to look like Volkov's rifle. The German 6th Army died because they worshipped the machine. They believed that superior engineering, tighter tolerances, and perfect optics would guarantee victory. They froze to death, clutching weapons that were too beautiful to work in hell. Volkov lived because he understood that in the chaos of war, perfection is a liability. He embraced the dirt. He weaponized the rust. In the end, the duel between the wolf and the rust wasn't decided by who was the better shot. It was decided by who understood the nature of reality. The wolf tried to conquer the ruins. Volkov became the ruins. And as history has shown us, time and again, you cannot kill a ghost that is already part of the graveyard.